Howdy y'all, my name is Carson with SC Traditions, and I'm here to make your fishing adventure just a little bit easier. So when it comes to fishing, there are three primary types of line, and that is monofilament, fluorocarbon, and braid. And you came to this video because you want to learn all about that last one that I named, braided fishing line. So first off, what is braid? Well, braid is exactly what it sounds like. It is tiny little strings that have been braided. Just like the stuff they make your clothes out of, that's essentially more or less what braid is made out of. It's fabric that they have braided together, and then a lot of times they coat it in a really smooth resin. And in a simple definition, that's exactly what braid is. Now let's look at the pros and cons. Now I'm going to warn you and go ahead and say that the cons seemingly outweigh the pros, but braid's pros single-handedly trump all of those cons. First off, cons. Braid is super abrasion susceptible. What I mean by that is because it is made up of tons of tiny little strings. If you have a fish that has a lot of teeth, like a gar or something, braid has a tendency to get cut by that. Braid, if it's rubbing against rocks, if it's rubbing against thick sticks, it will slowly wear through that resin and start to fray those little strings, meaning that over time, that braid will become compromised and will break. So if you're throwing braid around heavy rocks, if you're throwing braid around thick stumps, stuff like that, keep that in mind. Keep that in the back of your head because you might need to retie just a little bit more often. Next, braid's a little bit hard to tie knots with. Fluorocarbon and monofilament are plastic-based lines. They're slick. They like to slide on each other. You put a little bit of water on them, they knot down perfectly. Braid, because it's a little bit rough, you can even feel it. You can feel the little individual strands. They don't like to slide against each other quite as nice as, say, those other ones, meaning that it can be really hard. You need to really make sure that your knots are on point and seated up against that hook. There's no gaps in between them, because when you hook into that 5-pounder, the last thing that you want to happen is you to set back on that hook and all of a sudden that braid come undone because you didn't check your knot. Next, braid is very visible compared to monofilament and fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon practically disappears in the water, but as you can see with this braid, you can see it even on the camera. How many times can you not see fishing line on a camera? Pretty dang often. I film pretty regularly, and sometimes I have a hard time finding my line if I'm looking for it. Braid, I got no problem in that. I can see it on camera as I'm filming right here, right now. So because of that, that also means that the fish can see it. So if you're fishing a lot of sight-based fish, say like trout, you might not want to throw braid. Now we can counteract that just by a little bit. You see, I'm throwing green braid. We're fishing some darker pond water here today, so I'm throwing green braid to try and match and minimize that visibility that this braid gives off. Same deal, you can throw red braid, you can throw black braid, whatever you're trying to match, you can kind of counteract that just a little bit. And going back to the knotting thing, braid can also seemingly knot when you don't want it to knot. So if you're throwing something like a bait caster and you bird nest it, because braid is rough, doesn't like to slide against each other, it can be really hard to get those bird nests out. That being said though, braid also has some really good pros to it. And number one, chief among them all, is that braid is super strong in a small package. And what I mean by that is, this diameter here, this is 15 to 20 pound braid. I don't remember exactly what I have on this rod, but it is only the diameter of about 6 to 8 pound test monofilament, meaning that I can pack a lot of punch. I can really pack on some heavy line on a relatively small reel because this is braid, and braid is super freaking strong. With that, what that also means is I'm fishing like really heavy cover, and I'm having to pull fish through heavy weeds, pull fish through the lily pads, trying to punch grass mats, that sort of stuff. I'm throwing braid because I'm able to work and rip my lure through that stuff. Something like a monofilament, something like a fluorocarbon, I run the risk of breaking that off. No matter how tiny or big the lure, if I get hung up in a hydrilla pad, guess what's gonna happen if I try and whip it out with monofilament? I'm gonna break it off, and I just lost, $5, $10, sometimes even $50, depending on how expensive that lure is. With braid, it's gonna stay tied on until the cows come home. It's gonna stay tied on until Jesus is called from up yonder. You ain't gotta worry about braid breaking as long as you take care of it. With that being said, when and where am I throwing braid? So I'm throwing braid on a lot of my bottom dwelling lures. So if I'm throwing jigs, if I'm throwing wacky rigs, if I'm throwing Texas rigs, I'm tying braid on. Now maybe I'll vary that test of braid. For my jigs, I might throw 50-pound test, 65-pound test, depending on how thick of stuff I'm trying to throw in. While when I'm throwing wacky rigs, Ned rigs, that sort of stuff, I might tie on, 15-pound braid. I'm really gonna vary that braid depth. You can also use braid though when you're throwing topwater. So a lot of times topwater frogs, everybody loves a good frog bite. Braid is really good for that. And the reason for that is braid has no tensile stretch. Basically, when you whale back and you set that hook, if you're doing something like you are with a frog where you really need to pack that punch when you whale it back, that's when braid's gonna come in handy. Braid's not gonna stretch. The second that you transfer that energy down into that rod, it's going straight through that line, straight through that lure, and it's going straight into that fish. Bouncing off of that, where am I throwing braid? I'm throwing braid 9 out of 10 times in really, really thick cover. Lily pads, hydrilla, I've said it a million times in this video. If I'm throwing in grass mats, I'm throwing braid. I don't have to worry so much about visibility with that sort of stuff. You know, if the fish have grass all sorts in their face, they're not gonna notice this tiny little green thread, at least most of the time. Some fish, really, really smart. So on the short list, throw it with your bottom dwelling lures, throw it with your frogs, and throw it in thick cover. That's when braid really and truly shines. I hope this video helped you out a little bit. We're gonna go down the monofilament and fluorocarbon train very shortly. Also stay tuned for some really awesome fishing videos. We're in the peak of fishing season right now, in kind of the late summer, getting into the early fall pretty soon. It's gonna be really awesome.